Okay, I think most people are probably in. I'd like to welcome everybody. Happy frigid night in Vermont. Kind of our first one, I feel like. And happy Wetlands Day. Today, I don't know if you knew, but it is World Wetlands Day. So happy World Wetlands Day. We hope you are all cozy and warm and tucked in tonight with a nice hot beverage and are ready to listen to some stories. We are really happy to have you here for this is our 8th annual evening of Bird Tales. And we're really excited this evening to be giving the stage over to some scientists at VCE, the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. And I think they have some great avian tales for you. So if that's what you signed up for tonight, you are in the right place. My name is Julie Filiberti, and I'm a member of the board of the Friends of Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. And our Friends organization works to support and help out the refuge in whatever capacity we can. And one thing we can do is promote the refuge by organizing some educational presentations and some fun events like the one that you're here for tonight. And we at the Friends are always looking for new members. So I have to put in a plug. We welcome new members. We welcome volunteers, anybody that's interested in also supporting the refuge. And that's easy to do. You can go to our website and sign up as a member. Or if you just want to go to the website and give some financial support as a donation, we're not going to turn that down. So you can show up there and do that. But would love to hear from you, would love for you to join the Friends and be able to stay up to date on everything that's happening up at Missisquoi. We'd also like to make you aware of a series of presentations that we're going to be having over the next couple of months. We're going to be taking a closer look at invasive species on the refuge and in Vermont as a whole, and particularly forest pests and forest health, taking a look at some aquatic invasives and also some of the terrestrial invasives. So we're going to bring in the experts to tell us why there's such a concern, what you need to be on the lookout for, and how we can all help to combat some of these invasives. The first one in the series is going to be on March 9th. And so if you go to the website, all the details will be there under our calendar tab. So there'll be links to get you into Eventbrite. If you're interested, you can sign up for those. So for those of you who maybe haven't been to visit Missisquoi before, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. The refuge is located in the northwest corner of Vermont in the town of Swanton. And it was established actually 80 years ago in 1943 to provide a protected resting and feeding area for migrating waterfowl. It encompasses over 7,000 acres of land and water. And 10 years ago, in 2013, it was designated a Ramsar wetland of international importance. It's also an Audubon important bird area. A majority of the refuge is composed of wetlands and floodplain forests where the Missisquoi River empties into Lake Champlain. This area is the most expansive intact floodplain forest in the state of Vermont. And the refuge also contains the largest bog in the entire Northeast, the 900-acre Maquam Bog. In addition to these expanses of unique habitat, the refuge also supports some shrubland and maintains 250 acres of managed grasslands for those important grassland birds. The refuge is an essential resting and feeding stopover for migrating ducks, geese, shorebirds, and other water birds. It's a haven for 17 state threatened or endangered species, including the spiny softshell turtle, the black tern, and recently the eastern meadowlark. So we have trails to walk on, rivers to paddle on, so come visit if you haven't done that before. With that, I'd like to honor the Abenaki by reading our land acknowledgement. The lands and waters of the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge are very special places to those who make it their home, and we, as the current stewards of this area, recognize our responsibilities in caring for these lands and waters. We recognize that these lands and waters are also important to the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi, the previous caretakers of this land. We are grateful to them and their ancestors for caring for this land and its surrounding waters for thousands of years. We understand the importance of this land in the indigenous heritage of the region and to the Abenaki, present and past. We recognize the hardships and suffering these families endured when they were pushed out of their traditional ancestral lands as European colonization took hold, and we acknowledge their agony and despair when their access to the Delta for subsistence was ended by the creation of this wildlife refuge. We invite our visitors to share in honoring this Abenaki home by engaging in mindfulness while enjoying the refuge lands and waters, and by holding the space with care and appreciation. So usually when you hear from these biologists at the Vermont Center of Ecostudies, they have their science caps on and are telling you all about their research. Tonight, they've shed their science caps and they have their storyteller hats on, and all of them in hopes of entertaining you with some never before heard bird tales. So to get things going, I'm going to pass the screen over to Susan Hindiger. She's the executive director of VCE, and she's going to tell you a little bit about their organization and then get us going for the evening. Go ahead, Susan.
Great, thanks, Julie, and thank you for inviting us to participate. What a fun event, and I'm really excited to hear the stories that my colleagues are going to tell. So it's my privilege to lead this terrific organization called the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and I wanted to make sure that everybody who's attending tonight has a chance to hear a little bit about what we do. And so I'm going to provide a quick overview before we move ahead with our stories. So at VCE, we like to say we unite people and science for conservation. So we're a nonprofit organization based in White River Junction. We have a staff that numbers 18, 12 of whom are on our science team, 2 who focus on science communications, and 4 of us are in administration and development. And so what do we do? First, we do what we call applied conservation science. That is research and long-term monitoring that has application for real-world conservation. We're based here in Vermont, and we focus on species that live and breed in the Northeast. But our work has taken us over the years all across the Western Hemisphere because many species migrate. And to conserve a migratory species, you have to consider its needs across its entire life cycle. And so we call that full life cycle conservation. To study species across their ranges, whether they're birds or insects or amphibians, we rely upon hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of community scientists, ranging from amateur to professional, young to old, expert to novice, people with a combination of curiosity and time and effort help us gather data and ask and answer questions about biodiversity. So the second thing we do is we engage people in our work. That's a really core piece of what we do and how we do it. Our community scientists over the years have helped us census breeding birds across the state twice, 25 years apart. They've helped the Vermont loon population recover from a low of 7 breeding pairs in the late 80s to more than 100 breeding pairs today. They monitor high elevation songbirds on more than 100 mountain ridge lines across the Northeast every June, something we could never do on our own. And through these projects and more, including submitting their observations and their checklists via eBird and iNaturalist and eButterfly, community scientists have contributed nearly 8 million observations of over 14,000 species to the project that we have called the Vermont Atlas of Life. And finally, the third thing we do is we deliver this work, the work we do with all of you, to people who can put it to use for conservation on the ground. We deliver science to decision makers, landowners, and others to try to ensure that the work that we do reaches its maximum potential for conservation. So aside from what we do in general, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting the ways that VCE and the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge and the Friends of the Refuge have worked together. So first of all, the Friends Group is both an eBird and iNaturalist sponsoring organization, which means it contributes every year to support VCE's administration of the Vermont portals for eBird and iNaturalist, in helping us to educate and increase its user base. So thank you so much to the Friends Group for that. The Friends host monthly eBird walks that contribute observational data to the databases that we manage. Last year, the Friends hosted a BioBlitz in the National Refuge that we helped with. And this, let's see. So what I wanted to show, the iNaturalist page for the Wildlife Refuge, which I'll put a link to in the chat when I'm done talking. That page that houses many of the observations that the BioBlitz made shows that the National Wildlife Refuge has recorded 4,937 observations of 997 species. So who's going to find the 1,000th species? Maybe it will be you. Another thing that we've partnered with the National Wildlife Refuge to do in the last couple of years has been some intensive bee survey work. And that work is continuing this year. And one of the outcomes of that has been to identify that the refuge is one of 12 important bee areas in the state. And those are priority areas that we've identified that warrant protection and management of imperiled species and habitats to protect Vermont's wild bees, critical pollinators. And then last year, 2 of tonight's speakers teamed up to tag an eastern meadowlark that was breeding in the refuge with a GPS tag that's part of a nationwide study that's looking at western and eastern meadowlark population dynamics. That's a study led by the Smithsonian. So these are just a few of the ways that VCE has been privileged to partner with the refuge and its Friends Group, and why we are honored and enthusiastic participants to be in tonight's program. So if you have a question about how you might get involved, you could submit data on iNaturalist or eBird or eButterfly. Any of these online tools that help you record your observations are really valuable for science. If you're an avid user or an experienced user of iNaturalist, you can go to that page, that Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge page on iNaturalist, and filter those observations for ones that still need an ID. A couple thousand of those 4,937 observations only have one identification. And if you know an ID of something that still needs an ID, you can move it from casual to research grade. And that really will improve its value for science. You can volunteer for any of a number of VCE community science projects, and I'll put the link to our volunteer page in the chat when I'm done talking. If you want to follow what VCE is working on and learn about ways you can participate, sign up for our e-news. And of course, we always appreciate, just like the Friends Group does, any gifts of support that help to support our organization. So reach out to us with questions following tonight's program, and I hope you get involved in both the Friends Group and in VCE. And without further ado, I want to introduce our 5 speakers, 5 of our rock star colleagues, starting with Mike Hallworth, who's our data scientist, an accomplished ornithologist, and so much more. He'll be followed by Jason Hill, who is another of our program leaders, an experienced ornithologist. Desiree Narango, our newest conservation biologist on staff. Nathiel Sharp, a staff biologist and an incredibly talented birder, naturalist, and photographer. And Kevin Tolan, who was the leader of our Eastern Meadowlark Blitz, and one of the people in charge of the recent effort to add GPS tags and electronic tracking mechanisms to our Bicknell's thrushes, both on the wintering grounds and on their breeding grounds. So I think Mike is first up. So take it away, Mike. And thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Julie, for inviting us, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm a data scientist at Vermont Center for Ecostudies. And so when you submit observations through some of those community science platforms, it comes across my desk and I convert it from a point on a map to predictions about where species are and how we can conserve them now and into the future. But as Susan mentioned, I'm an avian ecologist by training. So the tale I'm going to tell you tonight is about my trials and tribulations to catch what turned to be the ultimate trash bird. So for weeks, I tried everything I could to catch this elusive bird that thwarted my best attempts to capture it. You see, I had limited time to capture and track Louisiana water thrush wintering in the Caribbean. I studied these overwintering migrants in El Yunque Caribbean National Forest along the Rio Sabana in Laquillo, Puerto Rico. Rio Sabana and its tributaries have their headwaters high up in the cloud forests. Their waters flow over large boulders and create deep, opaque, milky blue pools in lots of different places. So this is prime real estate for water thrush, or so I thought. Water thrush, they tend to hop and feed from rock to rock, catching insects at the interface between terrestrial and aquatic systems. They pick insects from moss and the debris that accumulates on larger rocks and among log jams. They also forage on sandbars created by the rushing waters. So after many hours of observation, I found the best way to catch water thrush. And the most effective way to catch them was to put mist nets over the slow-moving pools. You see, they tend to hop along the river, but when they hit these pools, they often fly out over the open water, so it makes them vulnerable to capture. The nets, mind you, are really difficult to put up in these places. For starters, there's no way to put the net poles into the ground. There are simply too many rocks. So I either propped, wedged, or balanced net poles against rocks or among the sprawling buttress roots of tropical trees that line the river. I'd then carefully stretch the net out across the river, getting my feet soaked, sometimes up to my waist, trying my best not to fall on the slick rocks. And I needed to set them up quickly too, right? Because the water thrush are only in that vicinity of their territory for a very short time. So I'd scramble, and with any luck, I'd catch a bird. And when I caught them, I'd put color bands on them, and I'd attach a radio transmitter so I could easily track them as they go up and down the rivers. I did fairly well too, right? I caught a lot of water thrush my time there. I missed one. That one bird taunted me for weeks. Every morning, I'd wake up at that Sabana field station, and that unbanded bird would be in the gravel parking lot, flipping over leaves, looking for breakfast. This particular bird was on to me. It knew what I was doing, and it avoided all my nets for weeks. I literally spent hours trying to catch this bird. I tried a number of different locations across the streams. I put up pre-dawn nets in the field station parking lot. The local staff thought I was nuts, but I was willing to try anything, truly. It would fly down the river and chip as it would strategically fly over or around my nets. And I watched this bird fly up and down the river over and over this pristine pool, probably 100 times. So guess what I did? I set up a net and I waited. That bird was sure to let me know it was coming too. He'd chip like mad as he flew up the river. I was about to give up on this bird, but the problem was he was right dab smack in the middle of my study site. So I needed to know where this bird was going. One day, a few weeks before the end of the field season, and it was approaching fast, it happened. I finally outsmarted him. Instead of setting up nets in stealthy locations, or stealthy locations that I thought were good, I set up a really obvious net across this pristine pool in this tributary. The sun was all over it and it was droopy and sagging. I'd set up nets there countless mornings before. I hid among some buttress roots and I finally heard him coming. I could hear this bird's chips from a mile away. They resonated off boulders and large tree trunks. He flew over the net as he did countless times before, chipping as if to say, "Nice try, but not today." Joke was on him though that morning. I'd set up a second net just downstream where he'd normally land and taunt me with his chips and bobbing tail. I let him think that he had won. When he let his guard down, he flew straight into my literal trap. It was great. I'd finally done it. I'd caught him. I banded him and I put the last radio transmitter I had on that bird. I waited till the next morning to start tracking him. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to see what this bird was doing. I was jazzed to get out there and start tracking him. So I woke up the next morning and then I instantly heard the beep pulsing from the receiver. right from the front porch of the field station. It was great. I didn't need to travel far at all. He often foraged right there in the parking lot after it rained overnight, so I knew I didn't have to work that hard. And I followed the signal to the edge of the small bridge across the street. I call it a bridge, but it was really just like a large culvert that went over the tributary. He was under the bridge, or so I thought. I looked under that bridge, but no bird. I walked across the street so I could get a better look down the culvert. No bird. The signal was still strong, and it wasn't moving, but it was right there. So after a perplexing 20 minutes or so, the bird had flown up from inside and landed on the rim of a blue plastic trash can on the side of the road. He was foraging in the trash can. Here's a bird with access to this pristine riverfront property, but no, he was foraging in a trash can. For the next several weeks, he foraged in a handful of places. A mud patch in the middle of the forest with standing water and lots of insects, the parking lot of the field station, around and inside this blue trash can. There was one more place this bird spent almost all his time though. He spent most of his time foraging in a swale at the end of a discharge pipe that came out of someone's sink that led into the tributary. That bird that nearly outsmarted me was fueled almost entirely by insects feeding on garbage along a truly pristine river in the rainforest. I tell you this story because I've banded literally thousands of birds, but this one stands out. It challenged me in more ways than one. Not only was it exceedingly hard to catch, it challenged my view of what constitutes good habitat for migratory birds. The most perplexing thing to me, though, is that water thrush, Louisiana water thrush, are bioindicators of ecosystem health when they're breeding along primary clean headwater streams in the Northeast. And yet in the winter, they do what they can to survive, even eat insects that are coming out of someone's flow from their kitchen sink and just hanging out in this small swale, waiting so they can migrate back north to breed, where we can enjoy them for just a few short months. Thank you very much for listening. So thank you for being here tonight. I am going to pass the microphone over to our quantitative ecologist, Jason Hill. Take it away, Jason.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. I think extinction is a really abstract idea for so many of us. You know, we immediately think meteors, passenger pigeons, maybe, but probably more likely T-Rex and woolly mammoths. It's species that we've never really known personally. Standing in the middle of a rainforest 20 years ago, I turned around and stood face to face with extinction, something that would, within a year's time, become a ghost. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. My name is Jason Hill, and I'm a quantitative ecologist and conservation biologist. I am a trained ornithologist, believe it or not. I spend more and more of my time working with the things that birds eat, the invertebrate populations of the world. In the early part of my career, I was hopping around between field jobs, living out of a duffel bag and about $100 in cash in my wallet, jumping between continent to continent. And at that point in my career, I was already no stranger to extinction. In the 1990s, I had worked as an undergraduate at the University of Montana. I worked with black-footed ferrets, a species that we had thought was extinct until a rancher's dog in 1981-ish, I think, dragged a dead ferret to his back steps, and the species was rediscovered. Now we have several hundred black-footed ferrets in the wild in the United States and dozens of populations. Then I spent a year living in a lighthouse off the California coast, Central Coast, which was awesome, tracking sea otters, a species that was also thought to be extinct, overhunted for their fur until a population was rediscovered in the Big Sur area of California sometime around the late 1930s. So it didn't seem very far-fetched to me in 2003 when I got asked to be a part of a team to go to Maui and to save a species from imminent extinction. A species of Hawaiian honey creeper. Most of them are yellow and red and green and orange, curved bills and beautiful colors. It's a species that only a few dozen people in the world had ever seen, even at that point, and it lived only on the north side of Maui. There were only 3 known individual birds left in the world at that point, on the rainforest 3,500 feet above sea level. Living, each of the 3 birds living apart from each other, separate home ranges, like a mile or so apart from each other. They certainly had probably never met in their life. The species was called the po'uli. Now, this secretive species had only been discovered recently in the 1970s by a group of adventurous students from the University of Hawaii who had hiked into the Hanabi Rainforest Preserve looking for some of the other critically endangered Hawaiian birds like the nukupu'u or the o'o, or some of the many endangered plants there. Nobody believed them when they came out of the mountains with these sketches of this bird. So they went back with a shotgun and they brought back more than 3. Even at that time, the species was very rare and immediately became apparent that the species was declining. It was a small brown bird with a light colored throat and a striking black mask, as you can see behind me. Now, this is a huge section of the north side of Maui that is closed to the public. It's an amazing place. It's like a fairy tale. The clouds come in and the forest disappears and you're in the clouds. It gets cold at night. It'll freeze at night sometimes. 20-foot tall tree ferns. I mean, it's a wild place. And it's on the side of a volcano, Haleakala. And it's the second wettest place in the world. It's like you're living underwater. It just rains all the times. There are no real trails to speak of. There are so many critically endangered plants there. You're not allowed to walk around with a machete cutting trails unless you have one of the National Park Service biologists or Fish and Wildlife Service botanists with you. They swing the machete. So no trails. You literally crawl and crudge your way through the vegetation, grabbing onto roots and climbing up the 30-degree slope of the side of the mountain. The ground is like a combination of mud and hardened lava covered in mud. It is awful. And there's just mudslides everywhere. The ground is absolutely soaking wet. It is so tough, so difficult to even walk around in there. But in 2003, I packed my duffel bag and I headed to Maui. And for the next year, a dozen of us worked constantly in these 2-week shifts to try and capture the last 3 birds and to bring them into a captive breeding program like had successfully been done for the Hawaiian crow, which is a species, all couple hundred individuals exist in a captive breeding program, none left in the wild. So we'd fly in by helicopter with enough dried food to last a couple of weeks. We caught water to drink using a primitive catchment system from the daily rains. We can only open our mist nets to try to capture the birds when the forest was out of the clouds and it wasn't raining, because helicopters can't fly into these steep hillsides when there are cloud cover. They could crash into the mountain. In fact, that's how our helicopter pilot eventually died in the year after he finished working for us. But we couldn't capture any po'oli. We couldn't risk getting them, capturing them, but not being able to get them out to the Bird Research Center. Now, every day was like a combination of opening nets in the darkness, closing nets, opening nets, waiting for the clouds to clear, like that every day. And it's hard to really explain what it was like to be there. I mean, it was exhilarating and thrilling, and Maui's an amazing place. It was a very different Maui 20 years ago than it is today even. I mean, for one, it was physically and mentally exhausting. To trudge through this mud on these steep slopes, to work 14-hour days every day for 2 weeks straight, and have just one job, and to fail at it every single day for weeks and for months at a time. And to know that, the failure wasn't really just your own, not just your team's. It meant failure for the species. It meant permanent extinction for the species, the po'uli, if we failed. And, it was another example of the time when people that looked like me were failing the Hawaiian culture. Before our first helicopter trip in, we stood at the base of Haleakala and were blessed by a Hawaiian priest who asked the goddess Pele for permission for us to remove this species from the mountain, to take that which did not belong to us with the promise of preserving that part of Hawaiian culture. We had many close calls. I mean, I can remember times we were trying to capture we were trying to capture the last known male. There was 1 male and 2 known females. We figured if we couldn't capture the male, then it didn't matter if we had one of the females. So we spent all our time on this 1 male. And I remember several times, the walkie-talkies that we carried for emergency purposes would crackle and voices would come on and, oh, he's by the net, oh, just over the net, get down to Kuala 2, And we'd go sliding down the mountain to try to get to those nets. And I can remember him going back and forth over the net. We had some really close calls where he was just a meter from the net, and a couple times we couldn't get him. Seeing him occasionally was encouraging, but also disheartening at the same time. One day when the rainforest was socked in clouds, we closed nets, and just for a change of pace, for a mental break, we all took off and with our walkie-talkies for safety. And I thought I'd go out, hike 1.5 miles over and look for one of the remaining female po'ulis. I was alone. I was exhausted. It's cold, wet, I'm sure, because that's how it always was there. And pushing through this grove of tree ferns, which can grow 15, 20 feet tall. I was dressed in rubber boots and a rain suit, as I always was, and I was soaking wet, as I always was. I remember pausing to catch my breath on the steep slope, and I was looking at these ohia flowers, because a lot of Hawaiian honey creepers feed on the nectar that's produced by these ohia flowers. And I was looking at some birds through my bins, and then I heard this chip, chip, chip behind me. And I remember saying something out loud to myself, which I often did, something like, yeah, I'll get you in a second, hold on. And I eventually, looked at the Eevee and these honey creepers, and I turned around and, well, I should say, it wasn't unusual for honey creepers to approach us. These are species that have evolved without any native land mammals. So they would often come right up to us. They weren't afraid of people, or unfortunately rats or feral cats, sadly. So I turned around, I raised my binoculars, and it was just a blur. And I just instinctually put my binoculars down and started to wipe away my lenses. But then I realized that there wasn't any dirt or glass condensation on the glass. It was because there was a bird at eye height, and it was less than an arm's length away. I mean, it was just right there. And it was just looking right at me. And I don't remember how long I stood there looking at this bird, or it looking at me, because time seemed to stand still. I didn't know it then, and I only found out later that I probably was the last person to have ever seen a female po'uli. We never caught that male. Despite a year of Herculean efforts, we still failed. I left Maui with a lot of great memories, pretty good tan from my time at the beach, but also with this irrational feeling that, I and the other team members were somehow partially responsible for the extinction of the species. And that's still a feeling that I carry with me, and I use this motivation for my work. The next crew in 2004 was more successful than we were. There was an unusually dry, wet season that year. They were able to keep the nets open much more frequently than we were. They swapped crews in and out, kept mental and physical states probably higher than our crew did, and they got them. In September of 2004, that crew captured the last known male po'uli and known to exist. They, I'd say in many ways I was glad I wasn't there to see it, honestly. He was transported back to the Maui Forest Bird Center, just above where we used to live in Maui, in this triple-lined mosquito-proof cage. And Hawaiian honey creepers have evolved in isolation from avian malaria. They have like near 100% fatality rates from a single mosquito bite infected with avian malaria. When they caught this male, the team was already in the effort trying to capture, 2 months after they caught this male in September of 2004. The day after Thanksgiving, one of the technicians went in to feed the po'uli his daily diet of snails, and that male was dead on the cage floor 2 months after he was captured, November 2004. The crew was already in the field trying to capture one of the 2 remaining females. They hadn't seen her at that point. I was the last person to have seen one of those females. And no one's ever seen a po'uli in the wild since. And the species was officially declared extinct in 2021. So a decade after this experience, I had returned to Hawaii, to the Big Island, for a conference, not knowing what it would feel like to be back, not knowing if Pele would remember me. I'm pretty sure goddesses have long memories. I ran into one of my friends friends from the 2003 crew. And it was just like old times, man. It was great. It was great to see each other. Fell right back into our old rhythms. We both knew, of course, that the recovery efforts for the po'uli had been called off years before, despite annual extensive searching for this species. And the race had now shifted to save the next critically endangered Hawaiian honey creeper on Maui, where there's only about 200 or so left of the ki'ikiu, formerly known as the Maui parrotbill. So over beers at the beach, we talked about everything except the Po'uli. I think even after a decade, neither of us really wanted to go back to that place. So I'll say, excuse me, I get choked up just thinking about it. Geez. But I will say we did lock eyes at one point, raised our glasses, and we silently toasted the small brown bird with the light colored throat and the striking black mask. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Desiree.
Thank you, Jason. That was a really touching story. Wow, what an experience. Really incredible. Well, with that, I will share what my story is. But first, to introduce myself, my name is Desiree Narango. I'm the newest addition at Vermont Center for Ecostudies. I'm a conservation scientist. And my research program is really focused on understanding how birds and insects are responding to global change. And I work a lot in human-dominated systems, such as studying migratory birds in urban forests, breeding birds and non-native plants in residential yards, and migratory insectivores on coffee farms as well. But today, I'm going to tell you a story about a little bird that gave me a lot of lessons back when I was an intrepid young field technician. And that bird is the rusty blackbird, as you can see behind me. So the rusty blackbird is a subtly beautiful blackbird with a wonderful golden sheen on its newly molted feathers. And those feathers are worn off during the breeding season to become the blackbird with the white eye. They breed in wet boreal forested habitat, like what you can find in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, but they migrate and winter in the southeastern United States. The rusty blackbird is also in an alarmingly steep decline. We've lost more than 95% of the rusty blackbird population in just the last 40 years, and it's the most significant decline documented in birds in North America, Hawaiian birds excluded. Once scientists realized that we were losing this once common blackbird, we also realized that we actually knew basically nothing about them, nothing about their life history at all. And so scientists began to start research programs all over the country to learn more about this blackbird. And that's how I found myself driving to South Carolina on New Year's Day in 2009 to seek out rusties in the marshes of the eastern Atlantic coast. So I ended up working with a PhD student from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center who was studying the wintering ecology of rusty blackbirds. We were put up in a field house on an old farmhouse within the Ace Basin Wildlife Refuge, which is the largest undeveloped wetland ecosystem on the Atlantic coast. It was truly amazing, just a wonderful, beautiful place. And coastal South Carolina was supposed to be a real hot spot for rusties. And the Ace Basin in particular had these wonderful bottomland forests and marshes. So it was really thought to be the perfect habitat for wintering blackbirds. When I woke up in the morning and walked outside of my farmhouse, the first thing you see is this gorgeous freshwater marsh that's just filled with singing common yellowthroats and beautiful, stunning ibis and egrets and kingfishers all over the place. And if you walk down the trail, there were dikes that just went alongside, filled with water that had mottled ducks, more black-bellied whistling ducks than I had ever seen, tons and tons of wintering shorebirds, and even some swimming otters every now and then. Another fun fact is that just a short drive away from where I was staying in South Carolina was the estate where The Notebook was filmed. You know that movie with Ryan Gosling where they're in the boat? So I got to go to that estate, and at high tide in the evening, you could actually see dolphins out on the water in this property. It was really amazing. There was just one problem with the Ace Basin. There were no rusty blackbirds there at all. Every marsh that we went to go see was filled with red-winged blackbirds and grackles and all kinds of other marshland species, but no rusties at all. And so for the entire month of January, I was tasked to just walk around and go birding. And I walked numerous trails along marshes, along farmland, in wet forests, in dry forests. I searched every single flock of blackbirds that I saw, looking for a small blackbird with rusty tinges. But as much fun as that was, I was completely unsuccessful. We tried even to put up nets in the middle of marshes where we had to canoe out, which was a lot of work, but ultimately we caught bluebirds and phoebes and all kinds of stuff, but no rusty blackbirds. At one spot that I went birding, I even saw randomly a pair of whooping cranes from the introduced Florida population. And that was absolutely mind-blowing to have these cranes just come out of nowhere and land right next to me. But I was still disappointed because there were no rusties at all. And so after a month of searching all these spots where rusties had been reported in previous years, we were really just absolutely desperate. So at the time, this is 2009, there was a small website that was just starting to gain in popularity. And a good birding friend of mine had told me that it was like this really cool way that you could find rare birds in your area. The site that he was talking about was eBird from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which at the time was just a fraction of the behemoth data portal that it is today. Just for context, in 2009, there were less than 700,000 observations in eBird, but today those observations total more than 1 billion. Just last year, there were 225 million observations in 2022 alone. So I ended up searching eBird for rusty blackbirds in South Carolina, and sure enough, they were extremely scarce in the area. But there was a lone birder who was consistently reporting a few dozen rusty blackbirds on the other side of the state. And so I convinced my boss that we should check it out, even though the other biologists in the Ace Basin and other places were certain that this was a case of misidentification. They said, there is absolutely no way that this random guy is finding that many blackbirds on the other side of the state so far from the marshes. It has to be that he's misidentifying grackles. But like I said, we were desperate. We weren't finding them anyway. So that day we decided to pack up our gear and we drove the 4.5 hours to the other side of South Carolina so that we could hunker down in a small beat up hotel and start looking for rusty blackbirds. I'll never forget waking up that first morning and heading out. And the birder had told us that the best place that you could see the rusties was to try waiting at a parking lot that gave you this wonderful bird's eye view of the lake and wetlands in this local nature park. And so we went up there and we waited in the morning, waiting for the sun to rise. And at first there was nothing. It was really quiet. But as the sun began to rise and as it got lighter, we started to see small flocks of completely silent, dark birds just shooting overhead, just like stars, just 6, 7 at a time, completely silent. And I tried to get my binoculars on them, but the light was really poor. But they were silent and they were blackbird sized. And so we started to get really excited. But it turns out that they weren't actually headed towards the marsh. They were flying over the wetland to a small suburban neighborhood that was next to a gas station. So we packed up our stuff, we hurried over to find the flock, and the sight that we found was breathtaking. Hundreds and hundreds of rusty blackbirds, and almost only rusty blackbirds, were foraging all over the lawns and the roads. And as we walked over to look at these birds closer, we could feel this odd crunching underneath of our feet. And it turns out that the reason that the birds were in this neighborhood in the first place was for the pecan trees that were lining the neighborhood and yards. You know, pecans like pecan pie. And as the cars were driving over the shelves during their morning commute, the birds would take flight down to the road and gobble them up. It was truly an incredible sight. And there were more rusty blackbirds in that one neighborhood than either of us had ever seen. After that morning, the study was back on. We were ready to go. There were more than enough birds to study here. And at one point, our highest count totaled a flock of over 1,000 birds, which was the largest rusty blackbird flock that was ever recorded in the state. So every morning for weeks, we would wake up and we would watch the flock arrive for their pecan breakfast. And then after the morning warmed up, we would head over to the wetlands, or the rusties would head over to the wetlands to begin feasting on the invertebrates in the flooded forest once the water had defrosted. The nature park that they were feeding in the wetlands was absolutely beautiful, but it also happened to be a restored Superfund site from nearby industrial pollution, but it did provide rusty blackbird habitat as well. We ended up finding rusty blackbirds in other similar areas in the region. So in one neighborhood, our rusties were feeding on earthworms alongside robins and cardinals along turf grass. In another small park, we would find them perched up on the rooftops in the houses in the surrounding neighborhood, and then they would fly down to feed with a small family of neighborhood alligators. At one point, we even decided to follow the flock to their roosting location, which turned out to be a tire dump about 20 kilometers away from their pecan neighborhood. And this tire dump was bordered by cedar trees, possibly to hide all of the tires, I think. And at this roosting location, I saw more birds than I have ever seen in my entire life. And that's including my trip to Ecuador. At this one tire dump, I saw hundreds and hundreds of thousands of grackles, blackbirds, cowbirds, robins, and cedar waxwings, all roosting in one location. All of these species were converging on this one place so that they could sleep in these dense cedar trees. And when you shined your flashlight up into the trees, into the cedars, you could see dozens of eyes just peering back at you. It was really incredible. One day while we were watching foraging rusties, I had the honor of being joined by the late Russ Greenberg, an amazing ornithologist who was the first scientist to raise the alarm about rusty blackbird declines. One day we watched together as the birds flew to a lone tree and began to burst out into song. Quickly being joined by their friends, we suddenly had this huge blackbird symphony across the trees. And I turned to Russ and trying to show what a great budding ornithologist that I was. And I said, why do you think that they're singing in the winter? Do you think it could be territoriality? And without taking his eyes off the birds, and with the complete Russ Greenberg deadpan voice, he said, it's a gorgeous sunny day. Wouldn't you be singing too? We ended up getting a lot of great data. It's true. And the PhD student got her dissertation describing the habitat preferences, the foraging territories, and the importance of nuts and insects to the diet of rusty blackbirds. We also made a lot of friends. The birder who showed us the flock in the first place and took us on more birding adventures, the nature park manager who was so proud of their restoration work and that it was supporting such an important species. Of course, the homeowners who had been planting the pecans for years and loved to see the bird scientists and learn more about their species. And finally, the gas station attendant who provided so many great morning chats over coffee and also provided a bathroom, which is critical for fieldwork in urban environments. Those rusty blackbirds taught me lots of valuable lessons that stick in my mind today as I work on my own research program studying wildlife in urban ecosystems. First, even when it seems like things are at their worst, never give up, because you may just get a lucky break when you least expect it. The second thing I learned is that it's really important to listen to your community, listen to the birders and take in that community knowledge. Scientists aren't the only folks that know birds, and the communities know so much about their local area and the natural world, and they have so much to offer to the scientific community. The folks in the neighborhood had been planting these pecans for years, and by providing an opportunity to talk with them about their observations, we actually learned a lot about the rusty blackbird's behavior, which made our scientific research a lot easier. The third thing that I learned is that conservation opportunities for birds can happen in really unexpected places. And by only paying attention to the pristine, natural protected areas, we might miss opportunities to protect birds in really unique places that also support people too. And the last lesson that I learned from these rusty blackbirds is finally just to always take the time to enjoy yourself on a gorgeous sunny day. So thank you. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague, Nathiel Sharp.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Desiree. Hope everyone can hear me all right. I just want to say really quickly, thank you so much to the Friends of the Missisquoi for putting on this fantastic story sharing night, and also to all my VC friends for sharing their amazing stories. I'm going to get my screen sharing quick. All right. Hope everyone can see that okay. So as you can tell from this map, we're going to be going somewhere a little bit further afield here for this this little story I'm going to share, which is essentially the story of how I saw the rarest bird species that I've ever encountered. Maybe somewhat unsurprisingly, this took place in one of the most incredible sort of countries for avitourism, ecotourism, and for amazing bird habitat and birding and just sort of general naturalizing, which is, of course, Costa Rica. So this was, this story takes place on a trip, my first trip to Costa Rica with two of my best friends from the University of Vermont. All three of us, it was our first trip ever to Central America, to Costa Rica. For two of us, it was our first trip south of the Rio Grande. So we were all extremely excited to get into this incredible biodiversity of this incredible country and meet new people there, meet other birders, and most importantly, see as many birds as we possibly could while we were doing our tour of Costa Rica. So our first day we arrived there, I think our flights ended up getting in probably around 11 o'clock or midnight. And we went to get our rental car. And of course, with nowhere to go in the middle of the night, we asked very nicely if we could stay at the rental car place until it got a little light enough for us to go out birding. So big shout out to the San Jose Alamo rental car service for allowing us, three of us, to sleep in our Subaru Crosstrek in the parking lot that night. That was something they didn't need to do for us, but was a huge bonus to get a little bit of sleep before getting out birding. So our first day, right around in the center of all of these little blue dots on the map, we went to a place called the San Luis Canopy. So this was our first experience of real birding in Costa Rica, besides birding a bit around the Walmart parking lot, which turned out to actually have a surprisingly huge amount of birds, more than the grackles and pigeons and stuff that we were expecting. And our first main birding stop was out here in San Luis. This is an adventure park, so a lot of the sort of amenities were focused on high exertion hiking through the forest to waterfalls and all these really beautiful spots. There was a lot of zip lining and other activities to do here. But pretty immediately, we were able to find the group of birding guides and other birders who were there to see one species in particular that I'll get to later that was our main target for the day. So being our first day in Costa Rica, we were moving excruciatingly slowly, although not for us. We were stopping to admire every single plant and insect and bird we could find. And some of the first and most obvious of those were the birds that were coming into the bird feeders, which both the birds and the feeders look a little bit different there than they might up here in Vermont. Most of the bird feeders provide plantains and papayas and other fruits for a lot of these frugivorous birds. Some of the showiest of them are these tanagers. So we had maybe gotten 20 feet inside this park before we came to the first bird feeder and saw these incredible birds less than 10 feet away, just gorging on plantains and bananas and other fresh fruits. So the first one we saw was this incredible emerald tanager, followed up immediately by some of the most bright and colorful and entertaining birds either of the three of us had seen in our lives, things like silver-throated tanager and these amazing black-cheeked woodpeckers. Among the tanager flock, there was also a bay-headed tanager, one of the most colorful and just sort of amazing block pattern birds I've seen that rivals only the painted bunting, I think, in coloration. And then one of our main highlight birds of the day, the speckled tanager that we are extremely excited to see, was not at all guaranteed to be coming into this bird feeder and was excitedly pointed out to us by our new friend Mylor, who is going to be our birding guide throughout our tour of the San Luis Canopy, jumping up and down and waving us down to make sure we could see this bird before it flew away from the plantain feeder. So once we managed to make it about 100 feet past the entrance, we finally started to hit the trails and the hanging bridges through the canopy and started to explore more of this incredible area in the lowland tropical forests of Costa Rica. So you can see us on the left here looking up at some wood creepers and trying to figure out if it was, I believe, spotted or black, or I'm not sure. We had about 15 different species to run through. So we were learning, getting a crash course in Costa Rican ecology and bird biology very quickly. And then we had our guide Mylor up ahead there on the right, giving us some really helpful advice on how to bird in the neotropics, what to look and listen for, and just sort of how to exist in that space and how to quietly let the birds come to you, which was a practice that turned out to pay off pretty significantly later. So Mylor, our guide, was a guy probably in his 20s, about our age. So we immediately got along and it felt like we had just sort of had one more birder join our party. So it was really fun chatting with him, learning about these forests that he spends pretty much all of his waking hours in, and clearly knew more than any of us could ever hope to know about this one patch of forest. So as I said, the three of us were mainly focused on birding, but all being naturalists, we had to stop at all of the incredible orchids and flowers and butterflies and bees and insects that we saw, including this really beautiful Huntleya bertii, I believe, orchid that was blooming right along the side of the trail. So Mylor, if he was frustrated by our sort of slow going, definitely understood that we wanted to see everything along our way and was helpfully pointing out all of these incredible flowers and some interesting lizards, and something that one of my friends who has a bit of a fear of snakes did not appreciate so much was this massive Central American boa that was digesting a meal in the trees right above us on the trail. So even before we had seen our target bird for the day, we were already more than happy with our time in the San Luis Canopy Forest. And as we started to see more and more of the forest birds, we saw some species that you could almost imagine right here back in New England in the summer, like this tufted flycatcher, which looks pretty much just like almost any of your willow or alder or Empidonax flycatchers, just with a little crest. And some species that we really couldn't match up with anything we'd seen before, like this adorable little scale-crested pygmy tyrant, which could raise and lower that crest at will and provided some really incredible views of this really, really teeny kinglet-sized bird. As we continued to hike through the forest, one of the things that Mylor had been talking to us about and that we knew about our target bird was that we wanted to find an army ant swarm. So one of the sort of main focus points of a lot of neotropical ecology is the really fascinating bird life and other sort of predatory species that follow these army ant swarms as they march across the forest floor. So when we found this swarm, we knew that there would be a lot of other species behind it, not to eat all of these probably pretty tasty ants, but to eat all of the other insects, small mammals, lizards, and other species that sort of scattered in all directions when this army ant swarm marched across the forest floor. So as we were walking along, we heard Mylor doing something that we weren't quite sure about at first, but he was snapping his fingers. We weren't sure if he was just sort of keeping a tune in his own head or what he was doing. But as we walked along further, he was explaining that his snapping of his fingers was imitating the special bill snapping call of the bird we were looking for. So as we're walking along through the forest, he's just making these little snapping finger sounds just to see if he could get a response back. Finally, when we got to this army ant swarm, that's where he stopped snapping his fingers and instructed us all to sit down as quietly as possible and wait and not move, unless, of course, the army ant swarm moved towards us, and then we were allowed to keep backing up a little bit, even though each of us did get a few of these army ants in our boots and didn't love the experience, but certainly could have been worse. Finally, we had our first of the antbirds fly in, and these are species that follow around these army ant swarms, picking off all of the other insects that flee in any direction. So our first antbird that we saw was this bicolored antbird, which is this just adorable little plump bird with a bright blue eye ring of skin that follows these ant swarms and is one of the sort of most common and easily spotted of these ant following species. So before too long, we were sitting down in the middle of the forest here, watching these ants go over a log. And these bicolored antbirds would sit there waiting patiently by the ant swarm and picking off anything that would fly in front. So we got to get some really, really up close views of this really amazing behavior. with these really fantastic little birds that were completely oblivious to our presence and were just swooping in and grabbing food and eating it right there on that log in front of us. Eventually, we had another pretty amazing bird come in, and this is the ocellated antbird. So this is another species that's usually a lot more secretive, sort of hangs out low and in the back of these army ant swarms, and isn't usually as often hopping out into the open and providing good views like it is here. This was a bird about the size of a cardinal with, again, bright blue striking facial skin, really beautiful sort of black and chestnut patterning overall. And if we hadn't seen the bird that we saw next, this probably would have been our highlight of the trip. But as we were sitting there watching this army ant swarm wash over the trail in front of us, watching these antbirds dancing in and out, grabbing snacks along the way, we heard Mylor start snapping again, and we heard an echo behind us. We heard something snapping back. And sure enough, he taps us on the shoulder, and as soon as he does that, right in front of the trail goes something that I at first thought was a loose, lanky chicken. This was a bird we were searching for that I had done lots of research on, was extremely fascinated by its ecology and its sort of weird distribution, and had done everything but look up the exact size of this bird. I was expecting a bird maybe the size of our yellow-billed cuckoo or something like that, kind of long-tailed. But what ran out of the woods, ran across our trail and off into nothingness, was about the size of a chicken. And eventually when it turned back around, it was a rufous-vented ground cuckoo. This is a species of bird that is in a genus of birds that is worldwide some of the least understood and most actively sought after, the ground cuckoos. So as I mentioned, these are related to our yellow-billed cuckoos and species like that. Although they share that sort of family, they are extremely different. They're large birds. They run around on the ground like road runners. And a bird that's about 3 feet long should not be able to melt into the forest as easily as this bird did. We knew this bird was maybe 5 feet in front of us for about 45 minutes, and we could not see anything of it. We could hear it snapping its bill. We could see branches and vegetation moving, but this bird that was right there in front of us was completely disguised by the forest. Eventually, after about 45 minutes or so, as I said, sitting there with a nice Costa Rican couple who had traveled across the country to see this exact bird, we heard some more snapping in the background, and we realized that we weren't dealing with just one rufous-vented ground cuckoo, but 2 of them. This was most likely a mated pair that had been following around this army ant swarm at the San Luis canopy for weeks now. We had seen eBird reports dating further and further back and had hoped to try for this bird, but after about a week of no one seeing it, we were starting to worry that our luck might run out here on our first day of the trip. But thankfully to this bird, thankfully to San Luis canopy, and thankfully to our guide Mylor, we were able to see not 1, but 2 of these incredible rufous-vented ground cuckoos, a bird that has fewer than 1,000 observations on eBird, a species that ranges from Central America to Northern South America, and is seen extremely infrequently throughout that really wide range. And this was the species that we saw on our first day of what turned into one of the most incredible birding trips of my life, that I looked over at my 2 friends after we had seen this bird, after we had seen them interacting, bill snapping, foraging through the woods. They ran off, snapping along the whole way. And the 3 of us kind of just looked at each other, looked at Mylor, weren't really sure what to do. So the only celebration we could think of was to aggressively just take our hat off and throw it on the ground in one big pile. And that's how we celebrated the rufous-vented ground cuckoo. And to this day, this is one of the most memorable bird encounters I've ever had. And I'm, really happy to be looking back to these photos and remembering a really special trip. That if anyone would like to see a few more photos from that trip or learn more about where we went birding in Costa Rica, I will add the eBird trip report to the chat so folks can explore around in there. And with that, I will stop screen sharing and turn things over to my friend, Kevin Tolan.
Thanks. Really happy to be here. I did spend a lot of time in Missisquoi this past year, along with Jason, chasing meadowlarks, and there's a lot of meadowlarks up in the Alberg area as well. So hope that people enjoy my story, and thanks to the refuge and the group for all you've been doing for conservation up there. In mid-January, we headed down to the Dominican Republic for the first time in a couple of years. Or for Chris, he does it almost yearly. It was almost his 50th time down there. For Susan and I, it was our first. this opportunity arose to go down with a team of 4 of us, Susan, Chris, myself, and Jim Getz, our new Caribbean coordinator, to meet up with some of our partners down in the Dominican Republic to search for Bicknell's thrush, which if you're familiar with Vermont Center for Ecostudies, you know about this bird. It's one of the birds we work with a lot on Mount Mansfield. And for the past couple of decades, we've worked with down in the Dominican Republic. The goal of going down was to set these little transmitter backpacks on these birds, similar to the ones that Mike had mentioned using in the past, and similar, although different, to the ones that we have put on Bicknell's thrush in the past. These are MODIS tags, so they take advantage of a series of basically cellular towers across the country, and soon there will be some up in the Dominican Republic. And then we can track their migration via these devices. This is very important to put them on down there because we don't really know where the birds that overwinter in certain areas disperse to. We know where they return to if we catch them on Mount Mansfield, but some areas down there, we have no idea where they're going to breed and what the habitat connectivity is like that. This is a quick map of Bicknell thrush habitat down in the Dominican Republic that's modeled by some folks at VCE. It's pretty much relegated to high elevation forests in Dominican Republic, similar to here in New England. However, there are some very drastic differences in habitat types that we'll see. The first site we went to was Sierra de Baruco. It's a national park down here in the south center part of the island, near the border with Haiti. This had probably one of the most brutal drives in of any place we've ever been. Extremely rutted out. We had to go about 30 kilometers in our 4x4s on these back roads. Took us 3 hours to go that far, so extremely slow going. And if you see up around the edge here and even around our campsite, it's a lot of pine. So we were right in the middle of this big pine stand along the road and some other places. If you've ever walked through a pine stand compared to a hardwood stand here, pines are sometimes easier to walk through because there's a lot less underbrush. These areas have also been cleaned out from old logging projects up there that harvested the pine because it's very straight, makes for pretty good lumber compared to some of the hardwoods down in the tropics. It's also extremely cold, which for people up on Mansfield is not much of a new thing, but I certainly wasn't expecting it down in the mountains of the DR, foolishly perhaps. I also hadn't been told it was going to be this cold. It's probably the coldest that some of the people down there had ever experienced in their times banding Bicknells at this site. Got down to around -3 degrees some of the mornings. We'd be waking up before the sunlight and the entire campsite would be absolutely covered in snow or frost from the night before and the insane amount of dew that settles when the temperature drops so rapidly. By 9 o'clock, any places in the sun had pretty much dried off completely. But at about 6,000 feet, even in the tropics, you're getting hit with some pretty cold conditions. This little opening right here was our campsite, and it's a little bit hard to see from this vantage point, but there's a thin line of foliage you can make out in this mapping. And that's the line between pines and broadleaf. So even though we were here in these pines, a lot of these trails were in the pines, a lot of the habitat that we were looking for Bicknell's thrush in looked like this, very swampy, wet cloud forest. The mechanisms for this patchiness aren't fully understood. Like obviously fire plays a huge role in maintaining the open pine forests, but how that plays in with the broadleaf and why certain areas are and aren't getting hit as hard, it's a pretty complicated question. The assemblage of birds here is pretty unique for the area. 2 of these species especially, white-winged warbler, which isn't actually a warbler like the ones that we have up here, and the western chat tanager are both highly range restricted to the mountains in this region, and some scattered areas over in Haiti. The Hispaniolan crossbill is similar to the red crossbills we have up here, and they're specially adapted for the endemic pines down there. There's some other specialties of the area, especially Lassalle thrush in the middle here. So relative to the robin, and they pop out in the roads during the early mornings, but pretty hard to see. I unfortunately did not see one, but some of our folks did, but I heard them a lot, and they're just as beautiful of a thrush song as most of the other ones. After Baruco, went up here to Zozal, which is the first private reserve in the Dominican Republic, similar kind of to a land trust here in Vermont. And this is a much different ecosystem, whereas Baruco is about 6,000 feet above sea level. Zorzal is only about 1,000 feet. So it's much lower, but it does have broadleaf forest. And this preserve was set up specifically for Bicknell's thrush based on habitat modeling that VCE has done. And 70% of it, all this dark green area, is forever wild, second growth broadleaf forest. So in theory, we would think of it as lesser quality habitat. It's a little bit shrubbier. There are more invasives present, but there are still bicks there in a very good amount. And they were actually a lot harder to catch than the ones at the other site. We got 14 or 15 at the first site and only got 6 here in the same amount of banding time. They were getting really close to our nets and they just wouldn't go in. The way that we band here is a little bit different than up on Mount Mansfield. On Mount Mansfield, if people have ever come up there to join us, it is just putting nets out and hoping the birds run into them. Down here, we were actually going out, finding a specific bird, and then returning the next morning to target that bird. So we know where they were, and they were in the area, and you could hear them getting close to the net. But a lot of the times, it was the worst case scenario, and they just would not get into the net. It is a much wetter site than up in Baruco. Up in Baruco, there is actually really no surface water, no streams or ponds. There was a stream, however, that bisects Zozal. It's also some patchy reforestation areas and sustainably grown cacao. And then also just some lower elevation shrubby habitat, lots of very spiky tree ferns that were hard to bust through. And the species here were much different, of course, than at the higher elevations. Black whiskered vireo is similar to our red-eyed vireo in that they are very annoying when they won't stop singing. They kind of disappear for about 2 months. I'm not entirely sure where they migrate to, but they're interesting species to be watching around fluttering. Ruddy quail dove is a forest species that was hanging out pretty low in the canopy. And when you're sitting around waiting for birds, they get pretty close to you, which is really cool to see. Antillean piculet, it's a small woodpecker. And then we also had a ton of migratory warblers down in this area. Cape May, they even had a Kentucky warbler and a worm-eating warbler, a bunch of redstarts. So it's a lot of our migrants that will soon be making the way up to Vermont soon. And then I just want to leave you with a quick shout out to Grupo Aragua, which is one of our partners down there. They have been helping purchase land in and around the national park to ensure that it is left alone and not deforested. And they also have a lot of reforestation work going on as well. So definitely, if you are interested in learning more about Caribbean conservation, that'd be a great group to do it, and check out their website. Quick photo of everyone from the first week. Pretty big crew, a couple people that are missing from this picture. An awesome mix of Grupo people. We had someone from the Ministry of the Environment, and then us, of course. And then also, just like Nathiel, I'll show my eBird trip report. So we started down in Baruco. We did a little bit of birding down here on the beach. Of course, you have to. And then up here in the Zozal as well. So this is probably a little more slideshowy than I was hoping it to be, but I hope people enjoyed listening about this trip. I'll definitely have a blog post out soon, and I look forward to comparing these results to our other GPS Bicknell research that folks are familiar with.
thank you so much, everybody. Those were such great stories. Really, really appreciate you guys doing this, and quite the variety too. So I enjoyed all of them. Some comments have been coming in that people have been enjoying these too. Okay, we just got a couple of comments that came my way. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. Can be for any of our storytellers tonight, or if you have any questions about the refuge. I know our refuge manager is in the audience, and he is happy to answer any questions you might have about Missisquoi. So great stories. Jason, I have to say that you brought tears to a lot of people's eyes, I think, including your own. So that's definitely an experience that I think people don't get to experience, luckily. But that's got to be something that you carry with you for the rest of your life, I'm sure. So thank you for sharing that. That was quite the story. They were all great, but that one kind of hit emotionally for sure. So
there are a couple of things filtering in there. One for Desiree about Desiree talking about the water defrosting. You mentioned water defrosted. What does that mean?
Oh, sure. So in South Carolina in February, it can be pretty cold in the morning. And so on the edges around the lake and the wetlands, the water would be kind of frozen. And rusty blackbirds like to forage in really, really shallow water. They like foraging in wet leaves and shallow water more than they like foraging in deep water or in completely dry areas. So when that water is frozen, they can't reach the invertebrates like the snails and like dragonfly nymphs and things like that that are underneath the leaf litters. They have to wait for the water to defrost. So from our observations, it suggested that they would gorge themselves on the pecans in the morning, and then once the water was available after defrosting, then they would switch to foraging on the wetlands. So they had a nice mix of carbohydrates from the nuts and protein from the invertebrates.
And then I think a question for Jason, I think, about why they wanted to catch the last male bird in Hawaii.
Oh, sorry, is that capture the last male instead of one of the females? To successfully start the captive reproductive system, we needed obviously an individual of both sex. Focusing efforts on getting the male was crucial, because without the male, it doesn't matter if we had a female. You could argue the other way as well, except it took 2 years to capture one of those birds. Focusing on the most critical member, the male, was the most important. If one of the other females had died during that time or become undiscoverable, which is what happened, then we could have switched to the other female. So the male was really the linchpin. When that male died in captivity, all efforts to capture the last birds in the wild, which were happening at that time, stopped. And there's extensive surveys, and you think breeding bird survey is extensive. You ought to go try doing some of the avian transects from sea level to the top of Haleakala that they do every couple of years. They're crazy, incredible. And so yeah, they've never seen another one since, and they've stopped all efforts to try to find them. But there are a couple of other critically endangered birds there. There are only a couple hundred individuals left.
Another one came into me for Jason. Was there a possibility to bring the females to the male?
Yeah, we actually
in the wild.
Yeah, in 2002, the crew just before me actually did that. They all these birds had been captured before, and they were color banded. That's how we knew we were looking at the same individuals. All these birds were, I think, 11 years old at the time that I was there, at least 11 years old. It's kind of interesting to think, that the last adult of their species they probably saw ever was their parents or their siblings. But they'd been captured like 5-6 years before, when there was a dozen plus individuals left. And before bringing a species into captivity is really a last resort. It's not what you want to do, if at all possible. How do you feed these species? We didn't even really understand their diet. So the best chance is to save them in the wild. And we did that in a number of ways. Extensive predator control around the existing home ranges for the 3 known birds. But in 2002, they captured one of the females. They put it in a cage. They took it over to the male's home range, let her stay in the cage for 3-4 days. Again, pretty weary about keeping her longer because we didn't really understand their diet terribly well. We don't want the bird to start going downhill, losing weight, losing fluids. 4 days, and they released her. She had a radio telemetry tag, a VHS tag on her back, and she flew 1.5 miles straight home that day. So at that point, Fish and Wildlife gave the approval to try to bring the species into captivity. They weren't sure what other efforts could be performed in the wild. I did that actually with California sea otters. We took otters out to the Channel Islands when they were trying to reintroduce otters out there, and those males turned right around, swim 100 miles over open water in just a couple of days back to their original territories. Animals know where they are, and they want to get back to where they're from.
Any other questions, Rich?
No, I don't see anything else. We do want to thank everyone for coming out.
Yes,
I did have a-
absolutely. And big thanks to VCE for being such willing and happy participants in doing some storytelling. So hopefully we'll have you guys back sometime in the future and do something similar. And you guys can share the wealth with some other staff and tell them how much fun it was. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Check out our website, check out VCE's website. There's lots of ways that you can pitch in and volunteer and be part of community science and protecting the places that we love and the birds that we love. So with that, I will say goodnight with the thank you, and we'll see you next time.